In the unforgiving wilderness of Alaska's Brooks Range, where temperatures plummet to deadly lows and nature shows no mercy, one man's fight for survival leads to a discovery that changes everything. This is the story of Marcus Kane, a seasoned mountaineer who ventured into the frozen mountains alone, only to find himself trapped in conditions so extreme they would kill most people within hours. What he discovered while seeking shelter would make headlines across the nation and prove that sometimes survival brings rewards beyond imagination. If you're enjoying this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Marcus Kane had spent 15 years climbing mountains. At 42, his weathered face told stories of countless expeditions, the successful summits, the narrow escapes, the friends lost to avalanches and altitude sickness. But nothing had prepared him for what awaited him in the Brooks Range that February morning. The veteran mountaineer had set out from the small outpost town of Wiseman, Alaska, population 72, at dawn. His plan was straightforward: a solo 3-day trek to document ice formations in the remote Arrogetch Peaks for a research grant from the University of Alaska. Marcus worked as a freelance wilderness photographer and occasional guide, scraping together income from various projects. This grant, a modest $5,000, would help him through the lean winter months. The weather forecast had promised clear skies and temperatures around -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Harsh, but manageable for someone with Marcus's experience. He'd packed accordingly: a 4-season expedition tent, a -40-degree sleeping bag, 72 hours of freeze-dried meals, 2 camping stoves with extra fuel, and layers upon layers of technical clothing designed for extreme cold. By noon, everything had changed. The storm came from nowhere, rolling over the mountains like a gray tsunami. Within 20 minutes, visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, transformed into a screaming monster that threatened to tear Marcus off his feet. His handheld weather station showed a temperature of -58 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping fast. With the wind chill, it felt closer to -80. Marcus knew the statistics by heart. At -80 degrees with wind, exposed skin freezes in less than 5 minutes. Frostbite becomes almost instantaneous. The body's core temperature drops rapidly, leading to confusion, loss of coordination, and eventually, death. He had perhaps an hour, maybe 2 if he was lucky, to find shelter. Fighting against wind gusts that threatened to knock him over, Marcus pushed forward, following what he hoped was a ridgeline. His GPS had frozen solid, the screen black and useless. His backup compass was his only guide now, though reading it in these conditions meant removing his outer glove, a dangerous proposition. The snow wasn't falling so much as being driven horizontally, tiny ice crystals that felt like needles against any exposed skin. Marcus had pulled his balaclava up and his goggles down, but still the cold found ways to penetrate. His beard, visible just below the face covering, had frozen solid, a mass of ice that pulled uncomfortably with each movement of his jaw. His fingers ached inside his mittens, despite the chemical hand warmers he'd activated. His toes had gone numb an hour ago, which worried him more than the finger pain. You could lose fingers and survive. Toes, too. But if the cold reached his core, if his body temperature dropped too far, he would simply lie down in the snow and never get up again. He'd seen it happen to others. The peaceful death, they called it. Marcus had no intention of dying peacefully or otherwise. Through the wall of white, a darker shape emerged. At first, Marcus thought it was just another trick of the storm, shadows playing in the swirling snow. But as he stumbled closer, the shape solidified into a rocky outcropping, rising like a fortress from the mountainside. His heart rate quickened, as much as it could in his hypothermic state. Rock meant potential shelter. Crevices, overhangs, maybe even a cave. He altered his course, moving toward the formation with renewed determination. The wind tried to push him past it, but Marcus grabbed onto the rock face, his mittened hands finding purchase in cracks and edges. The stone was so cold, it burned even through his gloves, but he didn't care. He worked his way along the formation, searching desperately for an opening. Then he found it, a dark gap in the rock, roughly 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. Without hesitation, Marcus dropped to his knees and crawled inside, dragging his 70-pound pack behind him. The relief from the wind was immediate and overwhelming. He lay on the stone floor for several minutes, gasping, his breath creating clouds in the beam of his headlamp. Slowly, as his body stopped shaking quite so violently, Marcus sat up and assessed his situation. The cave, if it could be called that, extended back into darkness beyond his headlamp's reach. The entrance chamber was perhaps 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough for him to stand in most places. The floor was relatively flat, covered in a thin layer of ice and ancient dust. Most importantly, it was significantly warmer than outside. Marcus checked his thermometer, negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Still deadly over time, but manageable. The cave's depth and the insulating properties of the rock protected it from the worst of the storm's fury. Marcus knew he needed to act quickly, despite his exhaustion. Hypothermia was still a real danger. With numb fingers, he pulled out his sleeping bag and pad, setting up a basic camp near the cave's rear wall where it would be warmest. He fired up his camping stove, thank God it still worked, and began melting snow for hot water. As the stove hissed and the water began to warm, Marcus allowed himself a moment to process his situation. He was alive, which was more than he'd expected an hour ago. But he was also trapped. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and he had no way to communicate his position. His satellite phone, like his GPS, had succumbed to the cold. He would have to wait it out. If you're enjoying this story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot. The first night in the cave was long and uncomfortable. Despite his insulated sleeping bag, the cold seeped through, making real sleep impossible. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, his body shivering continuously as it fought to maintain core temperature. Every few hours, he forced himself to eat and drink, knowing that calories were fuel, and fuel meant heat. By morning, if it could be called morning in the perpetual darkness of the cave, the storm still raged outside. Marcus could hear it, a constant roar like a freight train that never passed. He checked his supplies and did the math. If he was careful, he had enough food and fuel for 5 days, maybe 6. After that, he'd be facing some very difficult choices. The cave's entrance glowed with a dim gray light, but venturing outside was suicide. Marcus had seen whiteout conditions before, had even survived a few, but this was different. This was nature at its most hostile, a killing cold that would claim him within minutes if he tried to continue. So he waited, and as he waited, his mind began to wander. The cave seemed larger than he'd first thought. His headlamp beam, when pointed toward the rear of the chamber, seemed to suggest the space continued beyond what he could see. Professional curiosity, and perhaps a touch of cabin fever, got the better of him. Marcus packed a small day pack with essentials, extra batteries, water, his knife, rope, and a spare headlamp. If he was going to explore, he'd do it right. He'd heard too many stories of cavers who got lost or trapped in passages that looked safe but weren't. The cave narrowed about 20 feet from the entrance, forming a passage that required him to stoop. Marcus moved slowly, carefully checking the floor and ceiling for unstable rock. The walls here showed clear signs of water erosion, smooth channels carved over thousands of years. This hadn't always been a frozen hell. Once, water had flowed here, creating these formations. After 50 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Marcus stopped and swept his headlamp around, taking in the space. This room was bigger than the entrance area, roughly circular and perhaps 20 feet across. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone icicles, and corresponding stalagmites rose from the floor. In warmer months, water would still drip here, continuing the endless process of cave formation. But what caught Marcus's attention wasn't the geological features. It was the skeleton. Human remains lay against the far wall, partially covered by fallen rock and ice. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He approached slowly, respectfully, his scientific training warring with an instinctive unease. The bones were old, very old, scattered and partially disarticulated. No clothing remained, which suggested decades, perhaps even a century or more. Next to the skeleton lay what appeared to be the remains of a leather pack, almost completely deteriorated. And next to that, gleaming dully in his headlamp beam, was a metal box. Marcus knelt beside the remains, careful not to disturb them more than necessary. "I'm sorry, friend," he said quietly. "Looks like you had the same idea I did. But your storm didn't end, did it?" The metal box was roughly the size of a large shoebox, made of tin or perhaps steel, heavily oxidized but intact. Marcus's hands shook as he reached for it, and not entirely from the cold. This was someone's possession, their final belonging. Opening it felt like a violation, but curiosity, that fundamental human trait that had led people into caves for millennia, won out. The box's lid was stuck, frozen or rusted shut. Marcus worked at it carefully with his knife, not wanting to damage whatever might be inside. After several minutes of patient effort, the lid popped free with a protesting squeal of metal on metal. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oiled canvas, were papers. Marcus carefully lifted them out, his heart pounding. The documents were old, but remarkably well preserved, protected by the box and the cave's dry cold. He spread them carefully on a flat rock, angling his headlamp to read. The first sheet appeared to be a letter, written in a flowing hand, June 15th, 1897. "To whoever finds this, my name is James Thornton, and I am probably dead if you're reading this. I came north with the Klondike Gold Rush, like so many fools before me, seeking fortune. I found it, God help me. In these mountains, I discovered something that will make whoever claims it wealthy beyond imagining. But I'm trapped here by an early winter storm, my supplies exhausted, my strength failing." Marcus's hands trembled as he continued reading. Thornton had been a prospector, one of thousands who'd flooded into Alaska during the gold rush. But unlike most, he'd ventured far north of the Yukon, following rumors of untouched mineral deposits in the Brooks Range. And he'd found them. The subsequent pages contained what appeared to be a geological survey, remarkably detailed for the era. Thornton described a deposit of what he called blue copper ore, likely chalcopyrite or azurite, of exceptional purity and quantity. He'd mapped its location relative to recognizable landmarks, creating what amounted to a treasure map. But more than that, Thornton had brought samples. The final item in the box, wrapped separately, was a small leather pouch. Marcus opened it with shaking fingers, and several small stones tumbled into his palm. Even in the dim light of his headlamp, they were beautiful. Deep blue crystals, shot through with veins of copper and what might have been gold. Marcus had enough geological knowledge to recognize that these were unusual, possibly even rare specimens. But their true value? That would require proper analysis. He sat back on his heels, mind racing. James Thornton had died here more than a century ago, his discovery dying with him, until now. The location on Thornton's map, if Marcus was reading it correctly, was only about 2 miles from his current position, just over the next ridge. Leave a comment below about what you think Marcus should do. Marcus spent the rest of that day in the cave's inner chamber, reading and rereading Thornton's papers by headlamp. The prospector's handwriting grew increasingly shaky toward the end, the last entry barely legible. January 3rd, 1898. Can no longer feel my feet. The storm continues. I don't think I'll see another dawn. May God forgive my greed. May someone wiser find this and use it better than I could have. The tragedy of it sat heavy in Marcus's chest. Thornton had been so close to making it out, to sharing his discovery with the world. Instead, he'd become another statistic, Another body claimed by Alaska's brutal wilderness. How many others had died similarly, their discoveries lost forever? Marcus carefully returned the documents to their box, treating them with the reverence they deserved. These weren't just papers, they were a man's final testimony, his last hope for meaning in his death. The modern mountaineer made a decision. When he got out of this, he would make sure James Thornton's name was remembered, would see that his remains were properly recovered and buried. But first, he had to survive. The storm raged for 3 more days. Marcus rationed his supplies carefully, melting snow for water, eating half portions of his freeze-dried meals. The cold was constant, relentless, seeping into his bones despite the sleeping bag and the insulated pad. He developed a routine: sleep when exhausted, wake when too cold to sleep, force down food and water, check the entrance for any change in conditions, exercise to maintain circulation, sleep again. During his waking hours, Marcus studied Thornton's maps obsessively. The prospector had been remarkably skilled at cartography, his drawings detailed and precise. He'd used prominent peaks and rock formations as reference points, creating a network of landmarks that, in theory, should make the deposit's location findable. If the landmarks still existed, if they hadn't been altered by more than a century of weathering and geological activity, if Marcus could even reach them in these conditions. On the 4th morning, Marcus woke to silence. The absence of sound was so profound, it took a moment to register. The storm's roar, which had been his constant companion, had ceased. He scrambled out of his sleeping bag, ignoring his protesting muscles, and crawled to the cave entrance. The world outside was transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of pristine white under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The sun, hanging low on the horizon, it was still winter this far north, painted the snow in shades of gold and pink. The temperature, according to his thermometer, had risen to a balmy -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Marcus knew this was his window. Arctic weather was notoriously fickle. This clear spell might last a day, a week, or only a few hours before another storm rolled in. If he was going to locate Thornton's deposit, and more importantly, if he was going to get out of these mountains alive, he needed to move now. He spent 2 hours preparing methodically. Everything that wasn't essential went into a cache in the cave, marked carefully so he could potentially recover it later. He packed minimal camping gear, emergency supplies, Thornton's documents sealed in waterproof bags, and the ore samples. His satellite phone, which he'd been keeping warm against his body, finally showed signs of life, but there was no signal this deep in the mountains. Before leaving, Marcus spent a few moments with James Thornton's remains. Using rocks from the cave floor, he built a small cairn, marking the site. "I'll come back for you," he promised the century-old bones. "You won't be forgotten." The trek out of the cave and back into the winter landscape was like entering another world. The snow was deep, nearly 4 feet in some drifts, making progress exhausting. Marcus had packed snowshoes, but even with them, each step required significant effort. His muscles, weakened by days of minimal activity and inadequate nutrition, protested constantly, but he pushed on, driven by a combination of survival instinct and burning curiosity. Thornton's map indicated the deposit was northeast of his current position, in a valley between 2 unnamed peaks. Marcus oriented himself, using his compass and the sun, trudging through the snow like a man possessed. By midday, he'd covered less than a mile. The terrain was rougher than he'd anticipated, with hidden crevasses and unstable snowpack that required constant vigilance. Twice he broke through seemingly solid surfaces, plunging waist-deep into powder. Each time he had to dig himself out, gasping in the thin, cold air, checking his extremities for frostbite. The sun was beginning its early descent when Marcus crested a ridge and looked down into a narrow valley. His breath caught. There, Exactly where Thornton's map indicated was a dark streak in the mountainside, exposed rock where an avalanche or rock slide had recently cleared away snow and soil. Marcus descended carefully, his heart pounding with more than just exertion. As he drew closer, the exposed rock face revealed its secrets. The blue-green mineralization was visible even from a distance, veins of copper ore running through the granite, like rivers of frozen turquoise. And there, glinting in the low sunlight, were smaller veins of what could only be gold. He reached the deposit and ran his gloved hand over the rock face, his scientific mind cataloging what he saw even as his emotions reeled. This was significant, very significant. The copper content alone would be valuable, but the gold, if it was as extensive as it appeared, could be worth millions. Thornton's estimate of the deposit's value, even adjusted for inflation, might have been conservative. Marcus pulled out his camera, which had survived the cold, in his inner jacket pocket, and began documenting everything. Photos of the rock face from multiple angles, close-ups of the mineralization, landscape shots for context. GPS coordinates carefully noted. This wasn't just a discovery, it was evidence. In the modern world, claiming mineral rights required proof, documentation, proper legal channels. He was so absorbed in his work that he almost missed the sound. A deep crack, like a rifle shot, echoed across the valley. Marcus's head snapped up, his survival instincts screaming danger. He knew that sound. Ice breaking, snowpack settling, the precursor to... The avalanche hit the slope above him before he could finish the thought. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what happens next. Marcus had perhaps 3 seconds between hearing the avalanche and its arrival. 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. His mind, trained by years in the mountains, ran through options with crystalline clarity even as adrenaline flooded his system. Running downslope was impossible. The avalanche would overtake him in seconds. Running laterally might work, if he could reach the rocky outcropping 30 feet to his right, but the snow was too deep, his snowshoes too cumbersome. That left only one option. He dove toward the rock face he'd been photographing, pressing himself into the slight overhang at its base. It wasn't much protection, barely a few feet of stone protruding overhead, but it was all he had. Marcus curled into a ball, his pack over his head, and prayed to whatever gods watched over fools in mountains. The avalanche hit like a freight train. Snow, ice, and rock roared past him with deafening force. The overhang diverted the worst of the flow, sending it cascading around and over him rather than directly onto him. But the pressure was immense, crushing, trying to pluck him from his shelter and carry him down the mountain. Marcus felt snow packing around him, filling every gap, the weight increasing with each passing second. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The roar faded to silence. Marcus lay in darkness, packed in snow like a frozen corpse. He couldn't move his arms or legs, could barely expand his chest to breathe. The small air pocket created by his pack and body position was all that kept him alive. He knew the statistics here too. Avalanche victims had roughly 15 minutes before oxygen deprivation became critical, less if they were injured or panicking. He forced himself to remain calm, to breathe slowly and shallowly. Panicking would only consume oxygen faster and seal his fate. With agonizing slowness, Marcus began working his right hand, his strongest, his shooting hand from his days in the army, upward through the packed snow. Inch by inch, minute by minute, he created a small tunnel. His fingers broke through into open air, and Marcus nearly sobbed with relief. He wiggled his hand, enlarging the opening, then began the exhausting process of digging himself out. It took nearly an hour of constant effort that left him gasping and trembling, but finally he pulled himself free of the snow and collapsed onto his back, staring at the darkening sky. He'd survived. Again. But the avalanche had changed everything. His careful documentation site was buried under tons of snow and ice. Worse, the avalanche had altered the valley's topography, making the route he'd taken down now impassable. Marcus would have to find another way out, in failing light, with exhausted muscles, and with weather that could turn deadly again at any moment. He took stock of his situation. His pack had survived, though one strap was torn and several items had been lost. His camera, miraculously, still worked, its tough case having protected it. The samples and Thornton's documents were safe in their waterproof container. His satellite phone showed he'd moved slightly east, possibly putting him in range of a signal if he could reach higher ground. Marcus made a decision. Rather than trying to navigate in darkness, he would bivouac here for the night, then attempt to reach the ridgeline at first light, where he might get a satellite signal and call for rescue. It wasn't ideal. He was down to minimal supplies, but it was the smart play. He dug a snow cave in a drift against the rock face, using techniques he'd learned decades ago in mountain warfare training. The cave wouldn't be warm, exactly, but it would protect him from wind and provide insulation. He crawled inside, set up his sleeping bag, and forced himself to eat one of his last freeze-dried meals. As he lay in his snow shelter, Marcus found himself thinking about James Thornton. The prospector had been in a similar situation more than a century ago, trapped, alone, running out of supplies. But Thornton hadn't made it out. What had been different? Luck? Preparation? Will to survive? Marcus pulled out Thornton's documents and reread them by headlamp. Near the end, the prospector had written something Marcus hadn't noticed before. "I should have gone back when I had the chance, should have retreated to safety and returned better prepared. Pride and greed kept me here, convinced I could weather any storm. I was wrong. To whoever finds this, choose life over fortune. The mountains will still be here. You only get one chance to walk away." The words hit hard. Marcus had pushed on to find the deposit when he should have focused solely on survival and escape. He'd let curiosity and the lure of discovery cloud his judgment. How many times had he lectured clients about making smart decisions in the mountains, about knowing when to turn back? And here he was, making the same mistakes that had killed Thornton. But unlike Thornton, Marcus still had a chance. He would make it count. The temperature dropped as night fell, plummeting to levels that made even Marcus's cold weather gear struggle. His thermometer read -48 degrees Fahrenheit, and without the sun's meager warmth, the cold became a living thing, predatory, patient, waiting for any weakness. Marcus had learned to recognize the stages of hypothermia through hard experience. First came the shivering, violent and uncontrollable, the body's desperate attempt to generate heat. He was there now, his muscles jerking involuntarily despite being in his sleeping bag. Next would come the cessation of shivering, not because he was warmer, but because his body was running out of energy to fuel the response. After that, confusion, loss of coordination, and eventually, the final sleep. He couldn't let it get that far. Marcus ate the last of his high-calorie energy bars, forcing down the frozen chunks despite having no appetite. Calories were fuel, and right now, his body was burning through them like a race car engine. He melted snow for water, drinking as much as he could stomach. Dehydration compounded the effects of cold, making hypothermia set in faster. But these were temporary measures. The real danger was the long hours until dawn. Could he stay awake that long? Should he? Sleep carried its own risks in these conditions. Falling into too deep a sleep might mean never waking up. But staying awake all night would exhaust him further, leaving him weak for tomorrow's critical trek to higher ground. Marcus compromised. He would allow himself to doze, but set his watch alarm to wake him every hour. At each alarm, he would force himself to eat something, do some exercises to maintain circulation, and assess his condition. It was a survival technique he'd used before, and it had kept him alive in other desperate situations. The first few wake-ups were manageable. Marcus did jumping jacks in the confined space of his snow cave, ate small portions of his remaining supplies, and checked his extremities for frostbite. His toes concerned him. They'd been numb for hours now, but he couldn't see them in the darkness, and removing his boots to check would be suicidally stupid. Around what his watch indicated was 2 a.m., Marcus woke to his alarm and realized something was wrong. The shivering had stopped. His mind felt foggy, thoughts coming slowly. When he tried to do his exercises, his movements were sluggish, uncoordinated. Hypothermia was setting in. Marcus forced himself to focus, to think clearly despite his brain's growing lethargy. He needed heat, needed it desperately. His camping stove still had fuel, and while running it inside the snow cave carried carbon monoxide risks, the alternative was freezing to death. He made the calculated decision to light it, positioning it carefully and creating ventilation by poking holes in the snow cave's roof with his ice axe. The small flame was like a miracle, radiating blessed warmth into the tiny space. Marcus held his hands over it, feeling sensation, painful burning sensation, return to his fingers. He boiled water and made hot tea, wrapping his hands around the metal cup despite its burning heat, letting the warmth seep back into his body. The stove couldn't run all night. He didn't have enough fuel, and the carbon monoxide risk increased with time. But those 2 hours with its heat might have saved his life. By the time he turned it off, Marcus could feel his core temperature had stabilized. The confusion had cleared. He was still desperately cold, still in danger, but no longer sliding toward the edge of no return. Dawn, when it finally came, was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen. The sky lightened gradually from black to deep blue to a pale gold. The mountains around him emerged from darkness like silent giants, their peaks catching the first rays of sun and glowing pink and orange. Marcus crawled from his snow cave and stood on shaking legs, taking in his surroundings. The valley below remained in shadow, but the ridgeline above him was already bathed in sunlight. That was his goal. Reach that ridge, find a satellite signal, call for rescue. He packed his gear with methodical care, knowing that mistakes now could be fatal. Everything essential went into his pack. Everything else, the tent, the extra stove, most of his climbing gear, he cached in the snow cave, marking its location on his GPS. If he survived, he could return for it. If not, well, it wouldn't matter. The climb to the ridgeline was brutal. The slope averaged 40 degrees, steep enough that Marcus needed to use his ice axe for purchase with nearly every step. The avalanche from the previous day had left the snow unstable, and several times he felt the slope shift beneath him, had to freeze in place and pray it wouldn't slide. His body, weakened by days of inadequate food and sleep, by the constant battle against cold, protested every movement. His muscles burned with exhaustion, his lungs gasped in the thin air, his mind played tricks on him, showing him hallucinations of rescue helicopters, of warm rooms and hot food, of safety that wasn't real. But Marcus pushed on. He thought of his daughter Emma, 12 years old, and living with her mother in Anchorage. He'd missed her last birthday because of an expedition. He'd promised her he'd be more careful, would stop taking such risks. He intended to keep that promise. He thought of James Thornton, dying alone in that cave, his discovery dying with him. Marcus carried that knowledge now, carried Thornton's final testament. The prospector's story deserved to be told. His remains deserved to be recovered and laid to rest properly. That responsibility drove Marcus forward when his body wanted to quit. By midday, Marcus reached the ridgeline. His legs nearly gave out as he crested the final rise, and he collapsed to his knees in the snow, gasping. But there was no time to rest. He pulled out his satellite phone with trembling hands. 1 bar, then 2. A signal. Marcus dialed the emergency number with fingers that could barely feel the buttons. The call connected, and he heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a human voice. Alaska Search and Rescue. What's your emergency? Marcus's own voice cracked as he spoke. This is Marcus Kane, stranded in the Brooks Range. I'm hypothermic, low on supplies, and need immediate extraction. My coordinates are... He read off the numbers from his GPS, forcing clarity into his words. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. "Copy that, Mr. Kane. We're dispatching a helicopter from Fairbanks now. ETA approximately 90 minutes. Can you maintain your position?" "Affirmative," Marcus managed. "I'll be here." As he waited for rescue, Marcus pulled out his camera and documented his location, taking shots of the surrounding terrain, of the valley below, where Thornton's deposit lay hidden under avalanche debris. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The helicopter appeared exactly 87 minutes later, a beautiful red and white bird against the blue sky. As it descended toward him, rotors creating a hurricane of blown snow, Marcus allowed himself to believe finally that he was going to make it out alive. The flight to Fairbanks Regional Hospital was a blur of warmth and motion. The helicopter's medic, a young woman named Sarah Chen, worked on Marcus with efficient professionalism, checking his vitals, starting an IV for fluids and warmth, examining his extremities for frostbite. "You're lucky," she told him, having to shout over the helicopter's noise. "Moderate frostbite on 3 toes, superficial frostbite on your fingers. You'll probably keep everything if we treat it properly. Core temperature is 85 degrees. That's severe hypothermia territory. Another few hours, and we might have been bringing back a body." Marcus nodded, unable to form words. The helicopter's heat was overwhelming after days in extreme cold, making him dizzy and nauseous. He clutched his pack against his chest, protecting the camera and Thornton's documents even in his disoriented state. At the hospital, the emergency room team swarmed him. They cut away his outer layers of clothing, his expensive technical gear rendered useless by the extreme cold exposure. Warm IV fluids flowed into his veins. Heat lamps surrounded him. Slowly, painfully, his core temperature began to rise. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, the attending physician, examined him with a thoroughness that Marcus appreciated even through his exhaustion. "You're going to be here a few days," she told him firmly. "We need to watch for complications, cardiac arrhythmias from the hypothermia, infection from the frostbite, pneumonia from breathing that cold air for so long. But barring complications, you'll make a full recovery, though you're going to lose at least part of those 3 toes." "Small price," Marcus croaked, his voice raw. Over the next 48 hours, as his body slowly recovered, Marcus told his story to a series of visitors. First came the Alaska State Troopers, documenting his ordeal as part of their search and rescue records. Then came representatives from the National Park Service, concerned about his activities in protected wilderness. Marcus explained his research permit, his accidental discovery of historical remains. When he mentioned James Thornton's century-old skeleton, the mood in the room changed. The Park Service representative, a middle-aged man named David Brennan, leaned forward intently. "You found human remains? How old?" "Late 1800s based on the artifacts and documentation," Marcus replied. "A prospector named James Thornton who died during the Klondike Gold Rush era. I have his personal papers, his maps, and I know where his remains are located." Brennan made notes rapidly. "This is significant. Historical remains require proper archaeological protocols. We'll need to mount a recovery expedition once weather permits. You'll need to guide us to the location." "I intend to," Marcus assured him. "Thornton deserves better than to lie forgotten in that cave." But it was the mineral samples that generated the most interest. A geology professor from the University of Alaska named Dr. Raymond Silva examined them with an enthusiasm that reminded Marcus why he loved science. Silva ran tests, consulted databases, made excited phone calls to colleagues. 3 days after Marcus's rescue, Silva returned to his hospital room with results. "Your samples are extraordinary," the professor said, unable to contain his excitement. "The copper ore is high-grade chalcopyrite with unusual purity, but more significantly, the gold content. Marcus, this isn't just gold mineralization. Based on these samples and your photos of the deposit site, we're looking at a potentially major find. Conservatively, I'd estimate the accessible portion of the deposit could yield between $15 and $30 million in minerals. Marcus felt dizzy, and not from the lingering effects of hypothermia. 30 million? At current market prices, yes. Of course, extracting it would be expensive. The location is remote, the conditions extreme. But even accounting for extraction costs and the various stakeholders who'd need to be involved, Silva smiled. Let's just say you're looking at a life-changing discovery. But the path from discovery to profit, Marcus soon learned, was complicated. The deposit was located in the gates of the Arctic National Park, protected federal land, where mining was generally prohibited. However, some pre-existing mining claims from before the park's establishment in 1980 remained valid, and Thornton's documentation might constitute evidence of such a claim. Enter Margaret Voss, the attorney who appeared in Marcus's hospital room on day 5. She was in her 60s, sharply dressed, with the air of someone who'd spent decades navigating complex legal waters. Mr. Kane, I specialize in mineral rights and historical claims. Your situation is unique and potentially very lucrative, but it's also legally complicated. You need representation. Over several hours, Voss laid out the landscape. Thornton's maps and documentation, if validated, might establish a pre-existing claim to the deposit. As the discoverer of both the historical claim and the remains, Marcus might have legal standing to pursue that claim or to negotiate with parties who did. The state of Alaska, the federal government, native Alaskan corporations and private mining interests would all potentially have stakes. This will take years to sort out, Voss warned him. Litigation, negotiation, bureaucratic processes. But my conservative estimate, even in a worst-case scenario where you receive a minimal finder's fee, you're looking at $500,000. Best case, multiple millions. Marcus signed her retainer agreement without hesitation. Money had never been his primary motivation. If it had been, he wouldn't have spent his life as a struggling wilderness photographer. But financial security would mean something else. The ability to stop taking dangerous solo expeditions, to spend more time with his daughter, to choose his work based on passion rather than necessity. There's one condition, he told Voss firmly. James Thornton gets recognized. His name goes on any historical markers, any publications, any media coverage. He made this discovery. He died for it. I'm just the guy who found his work. That matters to me. Voss smiled. I'll make sure it's in every contract and agreement. James Thornton will be remembered. Word of the discovery leaked, of course. Within a week, Marcus's hospital room was besieged by media requests. He granted one interview to a respected science journalist from National Geographic, carefully controlling the narrative. The story that emerged emphasized the historical aspect, a gold rush prospector's tragic death and the century-late validation of his discovery, rather than focusing solely on the monetary value. The article, when published, created exactly the response Marcus hoped for. Public interest centered on Thornton's story, his final letters, the romance and tragedy of the gold rush era. Several historians reached out, offering to help research Thornton's life. A genealogist tracked down living descendants. Thornton had siblings who'd had children. These distant relatives were located in Oregon and Montana, families who'd never known their ancestors' fate. Marcus met with them via video call from his hospital bed. The eldest, a woman named Patricia Thornton Hayes, wept as he described finding James's remains and final writings. We always wondered, she said. Family legends spoke of an uncle who'd gone north and never returned. But we never knew what happened to him. Thank you for finding him. Thank you for caring enough to tell his story. Emma visited on day 7. Marcus's ex-wife Jennifer brought their daughter to Fairbanks. And when Emma walked into his hospital room, Marcus felt his eyes burn with tears he'd been holding back for days. Dad! She rushed to his bedside, then stopped, taking in the frostbite bandages, the IV lines, the monitors. You look terrible. I've looked better. Marcus admitted. "Come here, kiddo." She hugged him carefully, and Marcus wrapped his good arm around her. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry for scaring you. I'm sorry for always chasing the next mountain, the next expedition. I'm sorry for not being there as much as I should be." "You're here now," Emma said simply. "That's what matters. Just maybe pick safer hobbies, like stamp collecting." Marcus laughed despite himself. Jennifer, standing in the doorway, smiled slightly, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in years. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, Jennifer spoke quietly. "The attorney called me, explained the situation with the mineral claim. Marcus, if even half of what she's saying is true—" "I know," he said. "Things will be different, better, more stable. I can be around more, be a better father." "Just be alive," Jennifer said firmly. "That's all Emma needs, all she's ever needed. The rest we can figure out." Marcus was discharged from the hospital on day 10 with instructions for continued wound care, restrictions on physical activity, and stern warnings about avoiding extreme cold for at least 6 months. Dr. Okonkwo had been direct. "You've used up several of your 9 lives, Mr. Kane. The next time might not have such a happy ending." He returned to his small apartment in Anchorage, a space that suddenly felt luxurious after his ordeal. Heat at the touch of a thermostat, hot water from the tap, food from the refrigerator, these simple comforts, which he'd always taken for granted, now seemed like miracles. But there was work to be done. The recovery of James Thornton's remains required careful planning. The National Park Service, the Alaska Office of History and Archaeology, and representatives from Thornton's family all needed to be coordinated. Weather was a factor. The site wouldn't be accessible again until late spring at the earliest. Marcus worked with David Brennan to plan the expedition, marking GPS coordinates, describing the cave system, identifying potential hazards. "You'll guide the recovery team?" Brennan asked during one planning session. Marcus hesitated. The thought of returning to those mountains, to that cave, triggered anxiety he hadn't expected. Post-traumatic stress, his therapist called it. Perfectly normal, given what he'd experienced. But Marcus also felt a responsibility. He'd promised Thornton he would return. "I'll guide you," he confirmed, "but not until May at the earliest, and with a full support team. I'm done with solo expeditions." The legal process surrounding the mineral claim moved forward with the glacial pace Voss had predicted. Mining companies expressed interest, offering partnership proposals and buyout options. Environmental groups petitioned to prevent any development. Native Alaskan corporations invoked treaty rights to traditional lands. The federal government reviewed historical claim documentation. Through it all, Marcus maintained his position. James Thornton was the true discoverer, and any proceeds would be shared with his descendants. Moreover, any development would need to meet strict environmental standards and include full archaeological study of the site. 3 months after his rescue, Marcus sat in a conference room in Anchorage with representatives from a partnership that had emerged from the complex negotiations. A consortium involving the state of Alaska, a responsible mining company, Thornton's descendants, and Marcus himself. The terms were complex, but the essence was clear: limited, carefully controlled extraction of minerals from the site, with proceeds divided among stakeholders and a significant portion dedicated to historical preservation and environmental protection. The total value, assuming successful extraction, is estimated between $20 and $40 million, the lead negotiator explained. "Your share, Mr. Kane, as discoverer and claim holder, would be approximately $4 million after all taxes and fees." $4 million, more money than Marcus had earned in his entire life. More than enough to provide for Emma's education, to buy a proper house, to fund responsible research expeditions with full safety protocols. More than enough to change everything. "There's one more thing," Patricia Thornton Hayes spoke up. She traveled to Anchorage for the meeting. "We want to establish a fund in James's name. the James Thornton Memorial Fund for Wilderness Safety and Historical Research. We'd like you to help administer it, Marcus. You understand what it means to face those mountains, to take those risks. Who better to help educate others? Marcus felt emotion tighten his throat. I'd be honored. May arrived with warming temperatures and longer days. The recovery expedition assembled in Wiseman, the same small town Marcus had departed from 5 months earlier. The team included archaeologists, Park Service rangers, mountain guides, and Marcus himself, still feeling twinges in his frost-damaged toes, but determined to see this through. The flight to the cave site took 2 hours by helicopter. As they approached the Brooks Range, Marcus felt his hands tighten on his seat's armrest. The mountains looked different under clear skies, their peaks brilliant white against blue sky rather than hidden by storm. Beautiful rather than terrifying. But Marcus would never look at them the same way again. They landed on a plateau near the cave entrance, and Marcus led the team to the narrow opening where he'd sought shelter. Inside, the archaeologists worked with meticulous care, documenting everything before disturbing anything. James Thornton's remains were treated with the respect they deserved, each bone carefully catalogued and preserved. Among the artifacts recovered was a small locket Marcus had missed during his first brief examination. Inside were 2 photographs, faded but still visible, a young woman and a small child, Thornton's wife and daughter perhaps, left behind when he ventured north. Family he'd never seen again. Patricia cried when Marcus showed her the locket. He wasn't just a prospector chasing gold, he was a father, a husband, a person with people who loved him. He was, Marcus agreed quietly, and now he can go home. The expedition also surveyed the mineral deposit, confirming Dr. Silver's estimates. The site was everything Thornton's documentation promised and more, but standing there, looking at the vein of ore that glinted in the mountain sun, Marcus felt none of the excitement he'd expected. Instead, he felt somber, reflective. This deposit had killed James Thornton. It had nearly killed Marcus himself. How much was any fortune worth compared to living, to being with the people you loved, to seeing your daughter grow up? That evening, as the team made camp on the plateau, Marcus stood at the edge and looked out over the Brooks Range. The mountains stretched to the horizon, peak after peak of untouched wilderness. How many other secrets did they hold? How many other stories of ambition and tragedy, discovery and loss? His satellite phone buzzed. They had service here at this elevation. A text from Emma. "Stay safe, Dad. Come home soon. Love you." Marcus typed his response. "I will, I promise. Love you too, kiddo." 6 weeks later, James Thornton was laid to rest in a cemetery in Seattle, where his parents had been buried. His descendants gathered, along with historians, archaeologists, and Marcus. The headstone read, James Thornton, 1872-1898, prospector and pioneer. His courage led him into the wilderness. His discovery waited a century to be found. His story will not be forgotten. At the memorial service, Marcus spoke briefly about finding Thornton, about reading his final words, about the man's ultimate wisdom to value life over fortune. "James Thornton taught me something from beyond the grave," Marcus said. "He taught me that no discovery, no fortune, no achievement is worth sacrificing the things that truly matter." He couldn't go back and make different choices, but we can learn from his example. We can choose better. The mineral extraction began that fall, a carefully controlled operation with full environmental oversight. Marcus visited the site once, documenting the process for the historical record, but he didn't linger. The mountains had given him their gift, not the fortune, but the lesson. That was enough. A year after his rescue, Marcus stood in the living room of his new house in Anchorage, modest by some standards, but more than adequate for him and Emma during her visits. Photos covered one wall, mountains he'd climbed, landscapes he'd photographed, moments of beauty he'd captured. But the center position, the place of honor, was reserved for a different image. It was a photo Emma had taken, showing Marcus in his hospital bed, bandaged and battered but smiling. She'd titled it, "Dad, Survivor." Marcus touched the frame gently. He was a survivor. He'd faced the worst the mountains could throw at him and had come through the other side. He'd found fortune, yes, but more importantly, he'd found perspective. He'd found what mattered. The James Thornton Memorial Fund was launching its first grant cycle, funding wilderness safety education and historical research. Marcus served on its board, using his experiences to help others avoid the mistakes he and Thornton had made. Cautious risk-taking was one thing. Reckless endangerment was another. Knowing the difference could mean the difference between life and death. Emma would arrive tomorrow for a week-long visit. Marcus had cleared his schedule, planned activities they could do together. No expeditions, no assignments that would take him away. Just time with his daughter. That was the real treasure he'd found in those frozen mountains. Sometimes, late at night, Marcus still dreamed of the cave, of the storm's fury, of the cold that tried to claim him. But he also dreamed of survival, of the sunrise after the longest night, of the helicopter that carried him to safety. Life, he'd learned, was precious beyond any measure. It was a lesson worth $4 million to learn, though he wished he'd figured it out sooner and at lower cost. The mountains were still there, still beautiful, still calling to him, and Marcus would answer that call again, eventually, but differently now, with proper support, adequate safety margins, and a clear understanding of what he was willing to risk and what he wasn't. James Thornton had paid the ultimate price for his discovery. Marcus had nearly done the same. But from that frozen wilderness, from that century-spanning connection between two men who'd sought shelter in the same cave, had come something valuable beyond gold or copper, the wisdom to know what truly matters. And that, Marcus reflected, as he watched the sun set over the Chugach Mountains, visible from his window, was worth more than any fortune the earth could yield. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts and answering your questions. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.